It's time to start digging into Vue. We have three objectives for this lesson. The first is to load Vue onto the document. Secondly, we want to start using Vue by creating an instance. We'll explore what that means in a moment. Lastly, we want to verify Vue is working. We won't be able to move forward if Vue is not correctly functioning. In the resource section of this lecture, you'll find a zip file. Download and unpack the files anywhere. It doesn't matter where you unzip it. I recommend working in a directory where most of your development projects will live. Once you have that done, open the files in the editor of your choice. There's not much going on. The HTML file has a basic setup, nothing that will be unfamiliar to you. Along with the HTML file, I've included a style sheet. The stylings I'm adding have nothing to do with Vue. I added them in to provide some spacing for the elements we'll use in the next few lectures. It isn't necessary to have this, but I think it'll make things visually clearer. If you don't want to bother with CSS, you're free to delete this file. You will also need to remove its inclusion from the HTML file. Lastly, we're loading in a script, which is empty. We'll be writing some code soon enough. One thing I want you to notice is the div tag with the ID of app. This element is where we'll be writing most of our application code. You'll soon understand why we need an element to house our application in a moment. With the necessary files ready, let's load Vue. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the installation documentation page for Vue. There are several ways to download Vue. Most developers prefer to use the tooling to scaffold a new project. It's great that there's an official toolset for Vue, but we're not going to start using it. We will in a future section. We want to focus solely on Vue. For this reason, we're going to use the simplest method for loading Vue. We'll use a CDN. I find the CDN to be much simpler for getting started because it allows us to focus on Vue without all the bloat. It's truly the best way to experience Vue without committing to an entire toolset. If you're not familiar with the concept of a CDN, let me quickly break down what a CDN is. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. They're a vast network of servers that host static files like CSS, JavaScript, or images. One of the main issues of delivering files to the user is how long it takes for the file to reach them. A CDN will store copies of your files on different servers across the globe. Before a file is delivered to the user, the network will figure out what server is closest to the user. For example, if we're in New York, the CDN will deliver the file from a server located in New York. If we live in India, it'll deliver the file from a server located in India. CDNs are intelligent enough to deliver the file from a server closest to the user. This decreases the time it takes for a page to load. The Vue team has opted to upload a copy of Vue onto a CDN so that we can quickly get started without installing additional tools. A CDN works out of the box. Using the recommended CDN is a great way to get started with Vue. On this page, there's a section dedicated to using Vue without build tools. In the first code snippet, there's a script tag. Let's copy it to our clipboard. You do not need to copy the entire example. After copying it, paste it into the HTML file. Make sure it's loaded in before the app.js file. By adding one script, we've included Vue. This simplicity is one of the things I love about Vue. A lot of other frameworks require you to use a CLI to install many tools to get started. It's quite a hassle. However, with Vue, everything works with a single script. Vue does come with a CLI. We'll be taking a look at that later in the course. We're going to approach things in the most straightforward manner possible. The next step is to control the element with Vue. Even though we've included Vue, it does not automatically do anything to the page. We're the ones responsible for telling it what to control. Doing this is very simple. Inside the JavaScript file, we're going to call a function called Vue.createApp. The Vue object is defined by the script we added in. It has a function called createApp where it'll tell Vue to initialize a new application. The application it returns has the capability of keeping track of data and manipulating the document. This function has one argument, which is an object of configuration settings. We'll pass in an empty object. We'll add some settings later. The next thing we need to do is mount the application. The word mount is something you'll come across frequently in the documentation. It's used to describe the process of Vue inserting itself into the document. At the moment, we created an application, but we didn't tell Vue where to render the data. We need to instruct Vue where to mount the application. The createApp function will return an object with a method called mounts. We can chain the mount function after creating the app. This method has one argument. It's the element the application should mount itself to. The format for the value must be a CSS selector. In the HTML document, we have an element with the ID of app. We'll pass in #app. Be sure to pass this in as a string. That's important to note down. We've created our first app. It won't do anything, but let's check if it works. To view the file in your browser, you can double-click on it in your File Explorer or drag the file onto the browser. Typically, we would deliver our application from a server. Servers are computers that are capable of handling requests for an application. We're working locally, meaning we're working on our personal computers. The Vue team has developed a solution for creating a server on our machines. That's something we'll look at in a future lecture. For now, opening files directly in the browser will work. We won't be using features that require the necessity of a server. As you can see, nothing is happening. Let's open the console to check for some errors. I'll be using Chrome for this course. I recommend you use Chrome as well because it comes with the latest features of JavaScript and the best tools for development. You can open the console by pressing F12 on your keyboard. If you're on a Mac, you can press Command-Option-I. The console will not output any errors. Let's check the Elements panel for a moment. Nothing changes here either. Alright, so nothing is happening so far. How do we verify if Vue is controlling the element with the ID of app? There are a couple of ways, but I think the easiest way is to use the official dev extension. We'll take a look at this tool in the next lecture. We've taken the steps to integrate Vue into our document. Before we move forward, let's take the time to check the application with the Vue dev tools. It's a crucial step because the official developer tools will allow us to debug the application. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the Vue Dev Tools extension. The Vue Dev Tools extension provides information about your application. It's effortless to use, and it will be beneficial later down the line. Scrolling down, we'll find a link to download it for either Chrome or Firefox. I'm going to download and install this quickly. You should do the same. I've finished downloading the tool. If I were to refresh the page, nothing would happen. Why is that? In the corner of the browser, a new icon will appear that will be grayed out. This icon will light up green if we have a Vue application loaded on the page. We're creating a Vue app in the browser, so why isn't this turning green? The developer tools are unable to detect a Vue application. It's because of security restrictions in regards to opening files directly in a browser. Browsers will typically limit some of its features when delivering a file locally as opposed from a server. In the address bar, you'll see that we're accessing our page via the file protocol. The extension, by default, doesn't support this protocol. We'll need to activate it ourselves manually. Right-click on the icon. Select Manage Extensions. A new tab will open with the settings for the extension. We want to check the setting that says Allow access to file URLs. Make sure that this option is turned on. The settings will save automatically. Once that's done, let's try refreshing the page again. In some cases, you may have to exit out of the browser and reload the page again. The extension settings may not have taken effect until you have done so. Nothing on the page will change, but the icon at the top right will light up. That's a reliable indicator that Vue is functioning. If we were to click on it, it'll tell us that Vue has been detected on the page. We've verified Vue is working. The developer tools have so much more to offer though. We can view the details of the application from the Chrome Developer Tools. Open the Developer Tools if you haven't already. A new panel will be available called View. Click on it. If we were to click on the View panel, we'll find information about the application we created. At the very top of the Developer Tools, we can switch between tools. On the left side, a list of active applications on the page is listed by the tool. It'll even tell us the current version of Vue we're using in our application. Typically, you will find at least one app. Next, there are menu items for different categories of tools. Each tool can have another subcategory. We want to focus our attention on the Inspector Components tool. Not much info is available, which is expected since there's not much going on in the HTML or JavaScript file. However, under the list of components, there is an element called root. We haven't talked about components yet. You can ignore this term. It's something to revisit later. The root component refers to the element that Vue is controlling. It is the element that contains the overall application. This is very important to understand. You may only have one root component with as many children elements as you'd like. If you wanted to, you could have Vue control the entire page by assigning an ID to the body element. Then you can update the mount method to control the body element. It's common practice to load a Vue application within an element rather than the whole page. One of the benefits of placing it inside the div tag is to allow for multiple instances of a Vue application on the same page. I'm getting a little ahead here, but you can have numerous Vue instances within a single page. That's awesome. Anyway, getting back to the task at hand here. To verify if Vue is genuinely controlling the element on our page, we can select the root component. On the right, we'll see a button called Inspect DOM. If we were to click on this button, we'd be switched to the Elements panel with the element selected in the document. This behavior verifies that Vue is working. Congrats! You've made your very first Vue application. Admittedly, it isn't anything exciting, but it's a start. Let's quickly review what we know so far. To get started with Vue, we need to load it in. It's as simple as adding a script tag to the document. After installing Vue, we need to instruct it what element on the page it will control. Inside the JavaScript file, we created a new application by calling the createApp function. We pass it in an object to configure how the application will interact with the document. We didn't bother to configure Vue. It's something we'll get to in the upcoming lectures. Afterward, we chained the mount method. This method will tell Vue to insert the application into the document. It has one argument, the selector for the element where we want to insert the application. We want it to control the div tag with the ID of app. We can verify if Vue is active by taking a look at the View panel inside the Developer Tools. The root component refers to the element that's being controlled on the page. That's it. Nothing groundbreaking, but Vue is pretty simple so far, isn't it? In the next lecture, we'll begin making our application more dynamic. We have a very basic application. The next step in our journey is to add some data. Data is an integral part of any application. Data can be rendered onto the page like a username or profile picture. You can use the data to affect how the content gets rendered on the page. For example, we can restrict access to areas based on the data in our application. Adding data to a Vue application is simple. Inside the script, we can add a property to the object we passed into the Vue.createApp function called data. We'll set this property to a function. During the initialization phase of our app, Vue will search for a function in our configuration object called data. If it finds the data function, it'll call it. Vue expects an object to be returned by the function. Let's return an object. The object we return from this function will represent the data in our application. We can add any type of data we'd like. We can add strings, numbers, booleans, objects, and arrays. Let's create a property called firstName with a value of John. The object returned by the function will be registered with the Vue application we're creating. Vue will let us render our data into the document. That's something we'll want to do next. We want to render the name data property onto the document. We can do that by writing a JavaScript expression. Here's a quick refresher on expressions. A JavaScript expression is a single line of code that can be evaluated to a single value. The value can be a number, string, or logical value. There are all kinds of expressions. Here are some examples. Arithmetic operations, basic string manipulation, and logical comparisons are considered expressions. All three examples will evaluate to a single value. To add a bit more clarity, here are some examples that aren't considered expressions. Variable and function declarations are not expressions. The same goes for conditional statements. Vue enables us to use expressions in the document. Let me show you how. Switching to the HTML document, between the div tags, add two pairs of curly brackets. Vue will treat the content inside the div tag as a template. This will only apply to elements that are selected by Vue. In our script, we selected the element by chaining the mount function. Expressions can be used inside templates. An expression can be added to the template by writing a pair of two curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we can write an expression. For example, we'll add two numbers together. Whatever this evaluates to is what will get rendered onto the document. Vue will take care of finding the expression, grabbing the results, and then insert it into the document. Let's give this a test. We'll refresh the page on the browser. The expression will get evaluated. The result of the evaluation is what gets outputted instead of the curly brackets. That's thanks to Vue. However, we don't want to perform a basic math operation. We want to output the name we have in the data object. Let's head back to the editor. Back in the HTML document, we're going to replace the expression with the name of the data we added, first name. That's all we need to do. Let's test it out. Refresh the page. The name John will appear on the page. With very little work, we've created some data and displayed it on the page. There is quite a bit going on here, so let's go over it one by one. The expression is the name of the data property we defined in the Vue instance. All data properties are exposed directly by their names. We don't have to use the this keyword. Vue will be able to make the connection on its own. After evaluating the expression, Vue will replace the curly brackets with the value. You can think of the curly brackets as a placeholder. You may also hear this as being described as string interpolation. These two phrases can be interchangeable at times, but there is a difference between them. Expressions are the code inside the curly brackets, whereas string interpolation is describing the process of replacing a placeholder with a string value. Therefore, you can say, the expression first name is interpolated into John. A bit of terminology going on here. You'll hear people throw around both terms when discussing Vue templates. It's important to know what they mean when they use these terms. There is a limitation as to what you can insert in the curly brackets. Anything other than an expression is not allowed. You can't perform declarations or conditional logic. What do I mean by this? You can't define a variable and expect it to work. For example purposes, I'll replace the current expression with a variable declaration. This expression will not work, but let's see what the result of this declaration will be in the browser. Nothing appears. If we were to look inside the console, then we'll find an error. It tells us that we must avoid using JavaScript keywords, so that's one limitation. Another thing you need to be aware of is that expressions will always be outputted. You should always be careful what you put inside the curly brackets. This isn't a place to run code behind the scenes. That should be done in your JavaScript files. I'm going to revert this to the expression we had originally. Expressions can't be used outside of the template. The template would be the element we selected in the mount function. If we were to attempt to create an expression outside of the template, it would be ignored. For example, I'll copy the expression and paste it above the div tag. Going back to the browser, the expression will appear unprocessed. Expressions are only possible within Vue's template. The expression we tried creating outside the template was left alone. I'll go back to the document to remove the expression. One last thing. It's crucial we declare the data inside the data function. Vue will not search for data outside of the configuration object. For example, let's say we create a variable called lastName. Its value will be doe. Then, switching to the document, we're going to create an expression after the first name. This expression will output the lastName variable. Let's refresh the page to see the final result. We'll see the first name appear. The last name does not get outputted. If we were to look at the console, you'll see we get this error. It's telling us that we're using lastName in the template, but it's nowhere to be found in the data. This variable exists in our code, but Vue does not recognize it because it wasn't defined in the object returned by the data function. This is important to understand. You have to set your data from within the Vue instance. Any outside code will be ignored. Let's switch back to our editor. We'll remove the lastName variable. Instead, we're going to define it inside the data object like so. Let's refresh the page one more time. The name is fully appearing in the document. The errors have disappeared in the console. That's fantastic. Vue makes it incredibly easy to render data in our application onto the document. There will be times where we'll have data that we won't want to render on the template. In these cases, we can use the Vue Developer Tools to check the data. Open the Vue Developer Tools panel. Clicking on the root component will show us the data in the instance. Along with viewing the data, we're allowed to make changes. Looking at the data, we'll find the first and last name properties. This is a great way to check if your Vue instance contains the data for your application. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one. Vue does a pretty good job of keeping itself isolated from the rest of the page. There's nothing wrong with that, but you may want to control multiple locations on the page. This isn't common practice, but it is possible. Let's say we want Vue to control 2 elements on the page. One solution some developers attempt is to use multiple elements with the same class name. However, this will not work because one Vue instance cannot control multiple elements at once. Let's look at what would happen if we were to attempt that. Inside the document, we're going to change the attribute from ID to class. Then we'll duplicate it. We'll also need to update the Vue instance. Rather than using the ID selector, we'll need to update this selector to a class selector. Let's see what happens after making those changes. After refreshing the page, the first element will have the name inside the template. The second element is not processing the expression. Instead, the expressions get outputted as plain text. Not what we wanted. There aren't errors in the console either. So what's the problem? A Vue instance can only be mounted to one element. We're allowed to have children elements, but there can only be one root element per instance. If multiple elements match the value we pass into the mount function, Vue will assign itself to the first element it finds. This is why the first element displays the name, and the second one doesn't. What if we wanted to show the name in both elements? We would have to create another Vue instance with similar data. Let's give it a try. How about you try this as an exercise? Assign both elements unique IDs. Then create a new instance for the second element. Lastly, try changing the data for the second instance. You don't have to change the property names, just their values. Pause the video and give it a try. Welcome back. If you were able to do it, then congrats. If not, that's fine as well. Let's do it together. First, we have to update the elements on the document. We're going to assign ID attributes to both elements. The second element will have an ID of app2. Next, let's switch over to the JavaScript file. Update the instance to select #app rather than .app. After that's done, we'll make a copy where the selector will be #app2. Lastly, to show we have two unique instances of Vue, we're going to set the first name data property for the second instance to Jane. That'll do it. If we did everything right, we will be able to refresh the page with both names appearing. There we go. We have two unique instances of Vue. Even though they have similar names in the data object, they're completely isolated from one another. The first name and last name properties are unique to each instance. If we were to open the Vue developer tools, we'd find both instances appearing. Creating two instances isn't common. Typically, you will have a single application on any given page. I wanted to show you this as you may come across situations where you'll want multiple Vue instances. For example, you may be working on a site where you'll need to create a couple of small widgets. In these cases, you can create multiple instances to manage your widgets. We're going to focus on one instance. I'm going to comment out the code for the second instance in the HTML file, as well in the JavaScript file. I recommend you do the same before proceeding to the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to access the data after the instance has been initialized. In some scenarios, we may need to update the data in our app at a later time. For example, let's say we wanted to change the first name to Bob after 2 seconds. That's possible, but first, we need to store the app we created in a variable. We're going to assign the app to a variable called VM. We can call this variable whatever we want, but it's common practice to use the name VM, which is short for Vue Model. Those two words describe Vue pretty well. The word Vue describes the HTML we have in our document. It's what the user sees when they load our app. The word Model describes the data stored in our app. Vue is a framework that focuses on the view and model of an application. The phrase Vue Model is describing the relationship that Vue establishes between the two parts of an application. This is why most examples will use the variable name VM. After the variable assignment, let's invoke the setTimeout function. We'll give it a duration of 2000 milliseconds. Inside the function, we want to change the first name to Bob. To access the data from within the instance, we'll need to set vm.firstname to Bob. Let's stop here for a moment. At first, you may be thinking, this shouldn't be possible. The first name property is inside the data object. So shouldn't this line be vm.data.firstname? Usually, yes. But Vue does something magical behind the scenes to allow you to access the first name property from the object itself directly. It saves you time from having to write a long line of code. It's a process called proxying. I'll talk about what proxies are in a moment. First, let's check to see if this works. I'm going to refresh the page again. After 2 seconds, the name will change from John to Bob. Surely enough, it does. We can use the Vue developer tools to check if the data is changing internally. According to the tools, the data has been updated correctly. This behavior is precisely what we wanted. Vue makes it incredibly easy to access the data from within the instance. Let's take a moment to talk about what's going on behind the scenes because it's important to understand. First, we have to understand what proxying is. A proxy is a figure that represents the value in a calculation. That's the official definition. Let me break down what that means in relation to Vue. When Vue is initialized, it'll store your data in a property called $data. Therefore, to get the first name, we can use the following: vm.$data.firstname. This line will return the first name from the data object. The problem with this approach is that we have to type quite a bit of code to get the data. It isn't that annoying, but it can be simplified. Vue simplifies the code you have to write by creating proxy getters and setters. They're merely functions that'll take care of grabbing or updating the actual data. This feature keeps your code readable and straightforward. It's done behind the scenes for you. We can access the data directly from the object rather than access it through the $data object. Vue is capable of calling the correct functions that will access or update the data. The purpose of this is to make it convenient for you, the developer. Proxying is something you never have to worry about setting up. It's a feature built into Vue. This proxying feature is one of the reasons why developers love Vue so much. It's almost like magic. Let's take a look at the code that makes this possible. I'm going to comment out the set timeout function so that it doesn't disturb us. Then, let's switch back to the console of the developer tools in the browser. Inside the console, I'm going to log the VM variable. We will be able to see the contents because it's a global variable. Right away, there will be a lot of properties and methods defined in the object. Most key names start with either a $sign or underscore. As a side note, Vue likes to assign its own properties with these characters as a way to let the developer know their name's reserved by Vue. You shouldn't try to override these properties. Getting right back on track, scroll down to the very bottom. We want to search for something called getFirstName. Vue creates a set of getters and setters for every data property we create. They are proxy functions that take care of retrieving or updating your data properties. Whenever we type vm.firstname, the corresponding proxy function is called, which will get the actual value for you. Same thing for when you're updating a value. You can think of a proxy as a middleman for your data. Proxies work straight out of the box. You don't have to worry about setting it up or executing any additional code to get it to work. By using proxies, our Vue data is exposed directly from the object. That's one of the brilliant things about Vue. It allows you to keep your code simple and readable. We don't have to dive into the object to search for our data. Don't worry about all the nitty-gritty details. It's more important you understand the overall theory. Vue is here to make our lives easier. I wanted to discuss some of the theory behind it to get a better understanding of what's going on. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one. The app we built displays the full name on the page. Inside the code, we're using two expressions to accomplish this. It would be nice if we could make it into one expression. We could update the data object to hold the full name, but that's sometimes unrealistic. When we retrieve the data from an API, we'll most likely have to combine the data to get the desired result. That isn't too hard to pull off. Inside the template, we can combine this into one expression by removing the curly brackets and adding them. We'll use a string template to accomplish this. This is a valid expression. You're free to call functions or use arithmetic operations from within your expressions. Let's play with this a little more before we view the result. Since the last name property is a string, we can call the function toUpperCase to capitalize all the letters in the last name. This function is a native JavaScript function. It's not something specific to Vue. Let's refresh the page. The name gets displayed with the last name in all caps. We get the same result, but with one expression. The result is what we wanted. Well, sort of. The expression has become complex, which can be problematic. You want your expressions to be short and simple. It's recommended you perform complex logic in your JavaScript file. It's not ideal to write complex expressions inside the template. It will happen from time to time, but you will usually want to separate the logic from the view. Luckily, we can use something Vue calls methods. Methods are functions that we can call to perform complex tasks. Let's try creating one. Back in the editor, we'll update the JavaScript file. We're going to add a new property called methods. It'll be set to an object. The methods property is where we can define functions for our application. It works similarly to the data object. Functions defined outside of the Vue instance will be ignored. You won't be able to call them from your template. Vue will only use the functions defined inside the configuration object. Let's create a function that will concatenate the first and last name. The name of our function will be called full name. Inside this function, we're going to return the code we had in the expression. A couple of things I want to point out. First, to access the data from within the instance, we need to use the this keyword. Technically, this shouldn't work, but Vue will allow you to access the data like this thanks to its proxying mechanism. We don't have to worry about logging the object and finding out where the data is. It's accessible directly from the root. The second thing I want to point out is that I'm using a regular function. If you're familiar with ES6, you may be tempted to use arrow functions. However, this will cause errors in your application. It's not recommended to use arrow functions because of the proxying mechanism in Vue. The this keyword will not work if you were to use an arrow function. If you don't plan on ever using the this keyword in your function, then go right ahead with using an arrow function. Otherwise, always use a regular function. Now the question is, how do we use this function inside our template? It's quite simple. Switch over to the document. All you have to do is call it inside the expression. We'll replace the existing expression with the full name function. That's it. Let's try viewing the page. If we refresh the page, we will see the full name appear. The template looks a little cleaner because we were able to move the logic outside of the template. To summarize, methods are functions that you can use inside your Vue instance or template. Functions defined in the methods object are proxied by Vue. They're directly accessible in your template. If you would like to use the functions inside the Vue instance, you can access them via the this keyword. Since we're storing the instance in a variable, methods are also accessible through the VM variable. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one. The next thing we'll look at is directives. Directives are attributes that change the behavior of the element it's applied to. They're very simple to use. Vue comes with a few built-in directives. You even have the option to create your own. Let's start with some of the built-in directives. At the moment, the application is loading fine. But you may have noticed one problem. If we were to refresh the page, we would see the expression appear as plain text before it's been processed. This is because Vue and our application code haven't been loaded yet. For me, it's not much of a problem because I have a fast internet connection. However, that may not be true for anyone else who uses your application. If they were to see this, they might assume the application is broken rather than thinking it's loading. We can simulate their speeds by opening the Chrome Developer Tools. I assume you already know how the console and element panels function. The other panels are for more advanced uses. One of them is called the network panel. The network panel will output what files are loaded and how long they take to load. It'll display information about each request, but we don't need to go that deep at the moment. One feature I like is the ability to throttle the download speed. At the end of the options, you'll find a drop-down for connection speeds. Online would be considered your regular internet speed. We have options for other speeds. It's possible to create custom speeds as well. Let's try using the slow 3G speed option. Then, let's refresh the page by pressing Ctrl F5 on our keyboard. This keyboard shortcut will not only refresh your page, but will clear the cache as well. The expression takes longer to process because the scripts haven't been loaded yet. We have a basic application, but can you imagine what a page would look like with dozens of expressions? It wouldn't be very attractive to present our content like this. This is a common problem. There are multiple ways to fix this. By far, the easiest way is to use a directive. Using one is very simple. We'll switch back to our editors. Inside the document, let's add an attribute called vcloak to the app element. To the browser, this is an attribute, but to Vue, this is a directive. Unlike attributes, directives change how an element behaves. This behavior can be anything from changing the color to removing an element. All directives start with the V followed by the name of the directive. Directives can have expressions as values, but the one we're using doesn't require one. Therefore, we don't need to do anything else with it. This directive performs one single task. It'll wait for our Vue application to mount itself onto the document. The moment it does, it'll remove itself to wherever it's applied to. That seems silly because it's as if it doesn't do anything at all. The intention behind this directive is to help us hide elements it's applied to. However, that job is up to us to handle. Let me show you what I mean. The browser will identify this as an attribute even though it's a directive in Vue's eyes. We can use CSS to select this as an attribute and hide the element. Open the CSS file. Alternatively, you can create a pair style tags if you deleted the CSS file I provided earlier. At the bottom, we're going to add a selector for the vcloak attribute. Attributes can be selected by wrapping their names with a pair of square brackets. Inside the section, we'll set the display property to none. Any elements that have this attribute will be hidden in the document. Since this is the case, the user won't see the ugly expression. Eventually, Vue will be mounted onto the document, causing the directive to be removed. The styling we applied will be removed from the element we have the directive applied to. Anything being hidden will appear. Let's give it a try. Make sure you have throttling turned on. While the page is loading, the expression isn't appearing as plain text. After the page has finished loading, the name is rendered onto the document. This looks so much better and cleaner. Let's refresh the page again with the Elements panel opened. After refreshing, you'll see the vcloak directive attached to the element. The stylings are applied to the element. Once Vue has been loaded, Vue will remove this directive automatically, resulting in the removed stylings. This is the power of directives. Truthfully, this directive isn't very exciting, so let's explore some more directives. We'll learn what else we can do with directives. Before moving on, be sure to remove the throttling. One of the more interesting features of Vue is two-way data binding. Two-way data binding is the ability to update data through the HTML document or JavaScript file. That seems like it would be difficult to manage or pull off, but it's easy with Vue. Before we check out two-way data binding, let's surround the expression with a pair of paragraph tags. Then, we'll add a horizontal line right under it. We're adding these in for better formatting. Next, create two input fields and labels for the first name and last name properties in the data object. Let's refresh the page to see the final result. You will have something similar to what I have. The input fields are ready. Nothing will happen if we type inside them. That's to be expected. Now the question is, how do we tie these input fields to the data? The answer to that question is with directives. Vue provides directives for linking the data inside the input fields to the data inside your Vue instance. Back inside the document, we're going to start with the first name input field. We're going to add the directive called vModel. The value for this directive will be the expression first name. The values for directives are interpreted as expressions. Some directives don't require values, such as the vcloak directive we used in the previous lecture. However, the vModel directive does require a value, which is an expression. The value that gets evaluated from the expression will be used as the input field's value. You may notice that I'm not adding the curly brackets. Directives automatically assume the value is an expression. We don't need to add curly brackets. In fact, let's see what happens if we tried adding in some curly brackets. Afterward, we'll refresh the page. The application will throw an error. The console in the developer tools tells us that there was an error with compiling the template. It says that we have an invalid expression. The value for the vModel directive is already prepared to take in an expression. The fact that we're passing in another expression means we're trying to run an expression from within an expression. No wonder Vue doesn't like this. I'm going to remove the curly brackets. Then I'll refresh the page. The application is functional again. The input field is pre-filled with the data from the first name property. If we were to update the input, then the full name above gets updated too. This update is something that Vue will perform automatically for you. Because we're using the vModel directive, Vue will keep track of changes to the input field. If a change occurs, it'll update the data in our application. The data it updates depends on the value we used for the directive. This includes any methods that use the data. We don't have to worry about calling the function again because it's automatically called for us behind the scenes. This automation is what's called reactivity. Reactivity is the process of updating the document whenever the data changes. Once a change happens, Vue will look at the template. It'll identify any expressions that need to get evaluated again. The template then gets updated with the new values. Vue does a good job of keeping track of everything for you. If we were to use vanilla JavaScript, the code would look something like this. First, we would select the input field. Notice how I'm grabbing the input field by its ID. Without an ID, I could mistakenly grab the wrong input field. After grabbing the input, an event listener is attached with the keyUp event. If the event is triggered, the paragraph's inner text is updated with the input field's value. We can achieve the same results with vanilla JavaScript, but there are a few problems with this approach. The first is having to assign IDs and classes to the elements. There's a bit of management that has to go on. We're dealing with an input field and paragraph. What would this look like if we had hundreds of elements? It would get complicated quickly. Vue solves this issue elegantly with reactivity. It's keeping track of the data. It's also listening to events that could potentially change the data. If the data changes, it'll know exactly where to apply those changes without assigning classes or IDs to the document. I'm going to update the name again. As I'm typing into the input field, the name gets updated in real time. This is reactivity in action. In traditional websites, you would have to refresh the page whenever the data was updated. However, with Vue, the updates occur immediately. Vue takes this a step further by allowing us to use two-way data binding. Two-way data binding is the idea where if the data in the document is updated, then the data in the JavaScript code is updated as well. Vice versa, if the data in JavaScript were updated, then the data in the document will also get updated. We can see two-way data binding in action by opening the console in the developer tools. In the console, we're going to access the VM object, which contains the Vue instance because that's where we stored it. Then, we're going to access the first name data property. From the looks of it, the value in the instance has been updated. It matches the exact value in the input field. This time, if I were to update the value with JavaScript, I would see the changes reflected in the document. Surely enough, it does get updated. This feature is called two-way data binding. Any changes in the document will be reflected in the instance. Any changes in the JavaScript Vue instance will be reflected in the document. All we had to do was define the data property and attach the vModel directive to the input field. Let's try a simple exercise. The last name doesn't get updated. Try attaching a directive to the input for the last name. Pause the video and give it a try. Welcome back. If you are able to take on the challenge, then that's great. If not, that's fine as well. We'll do it together. Pulling this off is dead simple. On the input element for the last name, we're going to add the vModel directive with the expression last name. That's it. There's nothing else we need to do. Go ahead and refresh the page. If you were to update the last name above would update as well. That's the exact behavior we were looking for. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one. In some cases, you may want to have dynamic attributes. I'm not talking about directives, but actual HTML attributes with dynamic values. For example, let's say I had a link below the full name that points to Google. Rather than hard-coding the URL into the attribute, let's store it inside the data object. I'm going to call it URL. We want the href attribute to be set to the data property in the Vue instance. We learned previously that we couldn't use expressions inside an attribute's value. Vue will not process expressions placed inside attributes. Therefore, we'll need to use a directive. Luckily, you don't have to memorize 20 different directives for every attribute there is. Right before the href attribute, we're going to add a directive called vbind. In between the directive and attribute, we're going to add a colon. The vbind directive will allow an HTML attribute to have a dynamic value. You can apply this to any attribute by adding it before the attribute. The colon will act as a separator between the directive and attribute. By adding the vbind directive to an attribute, Vue will process the value as an expression. Therefore, we can set this attribute to URL. That's all we need to do. Back in the browser, we can refresh the page and click the link. The link will open in a new tab. The vbind directive allows for any attribute to have a dynamic value. Throughout the course, you'll see how incredibly useful this directive is. You'll get a lot of practice binding attributes. Because it's so common, there's a way to shorten this directive. Back inside the document, we're going to remove the vbind directive, but leave the colon in place. This syntax is a shorthand way of writing the vbind directive. If Vue finds a colon before the attribute name, it'll assume that you'll want to bind the attribute. Let's test the application. Back in the browser, we'll click the link again. Google will open a new tab once again. As you can see, either method works. Using the longhand or shorthand version is all preference. For the rest of this course, I'll be using the shorthand version. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to output raw HTML. Before we jump into the code, I want to take a moment to talk about some security issues that may arise from doing this. The security risk I'm talking about is called cross-site scripting. You may also hear it referred to as XSS. Cross-site scripting occurs when malicious or harmful HTML is injected into the web page, causing unintended behavior in the application. This usually happens when you output HTML from an external data source. For most of this course, we've been dealing with basic data. None of it contained HTML. The HTML was left inside the template. However, there will be scenarios where the HTML will come from the data source rather than the template. In these cases, you open yourself up to cross-site scripting. This is because your data will not be hard-coded like we've been doing so far. Your data will most likely come from an external source, such as a database or API. If those sources are compromised, your application will most likely face issues too. Before we go any deeper into this topic, let's learn how to output raw HTML. Previously, we inserted a link into the template with a dynamic URL. Let's recreate this, but with the HTML mixed in with the data. Inside the data object, we're going to create a property named raw URL. The value will be an anchor element with the URL pointing to Google. Then, inside the template, we'll create another pair of paragraph tags. We'll create an expression inside the tags for the raw URL data property. This expression will not work. Let's see why. Go ahead and refresh the page. Vue will process the expression. However, it will not render the HTML correctly. It'll get escaped, resulting in it being rendered as raw text. This is great in most scenarios. It means that if the data was compromised, then the worst a user will experience is a broken app rather than a malicious one. Now let's say I wanted to output the HTML unescaped. What then? We can render HTML from a data property by using a directive. Back inside the template, we're going to remove the expression. Next, we'll apply the v-html directive to the paragraph tag. The v-html directive will allow us to output unescaped HTML. The value of this directive is an expression. We'll set it to the raw URL data property. Let's give the application a test by refreshing the page. If we did everything correctly, the link will appear like the one above. We will be able to click on it. This is great. Thanks to the v-html directive, we're able to output raw HTML onto the document. Let's circle back for a moment. I want to take a moment to discuss the security risks with outputting raw HTML. There is a reason why Vue will only output data as raw text. It's because it's a safer solution. Let's pretend that a hacker suddenly gained access to the database where the URLs are stored. If they saw we had raw HTML rendering on the page, they could change the links to harmful sites. What would that look like? In the developer tools, we'll open the console. We're going to access the VM object, which contains our Vue instance. We will change the raw URL data property from Google to Bing like so. If I press enter, you'll see that nothing changes above. It's because I didn't change the inner text of the link. I only changed the link itself to use Bing instead of Google. If I were to click on the link, I'd be taken to Bing, which isn't what we wanted. This is one example of cross-site scripting. One common method for hijacking an application is done by convincing users to copy-paste code into their consoles. This will give them access to the data in the application. While the user is at fault in this scenario, we don't want our data to contain raw HTML. We should take precautions to ensure the application doesn't output anything we don't intend it to output. There are usually better solutions for handling raw HTML. You need to consider those solutions whenever you have to output HTML carefully. I want to give some final thoughts on this before we move on. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do to prevent cross-site scripting on the front end. Vue already does a good job of keeping us covered by only outputting raw text from expressions. However, that can't solve every scenario. Nowadays, there are browser extensions that modify the HTML on a page. Users may have these extensions installed. There's not much we can do about it. There are two things we can do, though. A lot of the responsibility falls on the back-end developer as they have full control over what gets inserted into the database. As long as they're securing their side, it makes our job so much easier. If you're developing on the back-end, make sure you're sanitizing and escaping any HTML that goes in and out. Our duty, as front-end developers, is to escape characters. Vue helps us with that. Secondly, make sure you trust the source of your data. Most APIs available are safe, but always make sure you know what kind of data you're receiving and expecting. As long as the back end of things are secure, your front-end application will be safe. Out of the box, Vue supports native browser events such as clicks, key inputs, hovers, etc. We can listen for these events to run a function whenever an event occurs. It's very easy to do. We can listen for events by using directives. Inside the app.js file, let's create a new data property called age. Its value will be 20. Then, let's display this age inside the template. I'm going to place it beneath the links we created previously. Let's say we wanted to add a button that will increment or decrement the age based on which button a user clicks. Below the input fields, we're going to add two buttons for incrementing or decrementing the age. Neither buttons do a thing at the moment. I want to be able to listen for a click. If a click is registered, we'll want to update the age property in the instance. The directive we'll want to use is called vOn. This directive will listen for an event. The name of the event it'll listen to needs to be added after the directive. Like the vbind directive, we must add a colon followed by the name of the event. In our case, this would be the click event. All JavaScript events are supported by this directive. The value of this directive can be one of two things. You can either execute code or pass in the name of the method you like to run whenever the event occurs. Let's try both. For the increment button, we're going to set this to increment. For the decrement button, we're going to use the decrement operator on the age data property. Something you'll notice is that I'm not adding the parentheses after the function name. This is entirely optional. If you don't plan on passing anything to your function, the parentheses can be omitted. Vue can invoke the function without a problem. The increment function doesn't exist. We'll have to define it. Inside the methods object, we're going to define the increment function. Inside the function, we're going to increment the age data property. I'm accessing the data via the this keyword. Inside the template, I'm accessing the data without referencing an object. That's because Vue will automatically assume any data you access in the template comes from the data object. Therefore, we don't need to do anything special to access the data in the template. Alright, let's give this a test, shall we? Refresh the page. We will see the age along with the two buttons. If I were to click either of these buttons, the age will increase or decrease depending on which button I click. By using the vOn directive, we can listen for events on our elements. Listening for events is a common practice in Vue. There's a shorthand available for listening for events. Back inside the template, rather than using vOn, we can replace this directive with the @ character. Be sure to remove the colon too. This attribute isn't valid, but that's perfectly fine. Vue will be able to understand that you want to listen for events with this shorthand method. For the rest of this course, we'll be using the shorthand way of listening for events. Let's explore some more events and dig deeper into what else we can do. If I were to write something into the text input fields, the name would get updated. That's thanks to the vModel directive and the reactivity that Vue brings to the table. However, let's say I wanted a bit more control over what goes on. The vModel directive is a combination of binding and using events in Vue. Let me show you what I mean. For the last name, let's say we wanted to insert ourselves into the update process. We can't do that with the vModel directive. If we want more control over the update process, we'll have to remove the vModel directive. Instead, we'll need to bind the value attribute. Take special note, I'm using the shorthand version for binding a value. The value for this will be last name. By binding the value, this input field will be pre-filled with the default value from the last name data property. If we were to refresh the page, we will see the input field for the last name pre-filled with the data property. However, if I were to update the input field, you'll notice that the last name does not update. The same is true if I were to use the Vue developer tools to inspect the data. The last name data property stays the same in the application. This is because Vue is setting the value on the initial run. It will not take care of updating the value inside the data property or listen for changes. We'll have to take care of that ourselves. Back inside the document, we're going to bind an event to the input field for the last name. The name of the event we'll listen for is called input. We'll set the value to update last name. This method doesn't exist. We'll need to create it. Inside the methods object, we're going to define the update last name function. How do we grab the value from the input field? In the function, we can update it to include a parameter called event. When Vue calls your function, it'll automatically pass your method the event object. The event object is the typical JavaScript event object you would encounter in plain JavaScript. We can update the last name property to event.target.value. The target object refers to the element that is currently triggering the event. Since it's the input field, we can access a property called value, which contains the current value inside the input field. We can use this property to update the last name data property. Let's give this a whirl, shall we? Refresh the page and try updating the last name. After updating the input for the last name, the expression for the full name will get updated. By using bindings and listening for events, we were able to mimic the same behavior the Vue model directive performs. The difference being is that we can do more during the process if we need such control. Otherwise, these two do the exact same thing. The Vue model directive is described as being syntactic sugar. You're free to use either one as you wish. I recommend using the Vue model directive whenever possible because it means writing less code. In this lecture, we're going to quickly explore how we can pass on data with events. Let's say we wanted to pass along some data to our events. For example, a simple message to log into the console. Let's see how that would work. Let's go back to the template in the editor. Inside the directive, I'm going to pass on the following message. Last name event triggered. Unfortunately, this will break our function. It's because we're expecting an event object inside the function. This is one point I want to highlight. If you don't pass on arguments to the function, Vue will pass the event object for you. Now that we're passing in our own arguments, we have to pass the event object manually. We'll pass it in as the second argument to the function. Vue will assign the event object a special name called $event. In our template, Vue will store the data related to the event in an object called $event. You must add the $ symbol because it's the name Vue will assign the event object to. The next step is to update the function in the application to handle the new arguments. Inside the update last name function, we're going to set the first parameter to message and the second parameter to event. Then, inside the function, we will log the message parameter. While we're at it, let's prevent the default behavior. It's normal to want to avoid the default behavior of an event to prevent unexpected behavior. We're dealing with a regular event object in our function. We can call the event.preventDefault method to prevent the default behavior. That'll do it. Refresh the page with the console opened. If we were to input some random gibberish, the last name will get updated. In the console, the message we passed into the function was logged. We can customize the behavior of our event handlers by passing in arguments. Vue will take care of calling the function for handling the event with the arguments you pass in. If we decide to add additional arguments, we will need to update our functions to accept the event object if we plan on using it. Vue will not do it automatically unless you don't provide arguments. We'll continue learning about events in the next lecture. There's one last thing I want to talk about when it comes to working with events in Vue. Let's go back to the function we defined in the configuration object. Inside the function, you'll notice we're calling the event.preventDefault method. This behavior is standard in most applications because you may not want the default browser behavior to affect your application. However, it's kind of repetitive and takes up room in our code. Luckily, Vue provides a way to simplify this. Vue has a feature called event modifiers. Event modifiers do precisely what you think they do. They modify the way an event is handled. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the official documentation for event modifiers. Here is what Vue says about them. It is a very common need to call event.preventDefault or event.stopPropagation inside event handlers. Although we can do this easily inside methods, it would be better if the methods can be purely about data logic rather than having to deal with DOM event details. To address this problem, Vue provides event modifiers for v-on. Down below are some examples. Let's give one of them a shot. Back inside the template, we'll want to apply an event modifier to the input event. Event modifiers can be used by adding a dot after the event name. This dot is followed by the modifier you'd like to use. I want to stop the default behavior of the event. Vue comes with an event modifier called prevent. I'll add this modifier to our event. Adding this is the equivalent of calling the preventDefault method in our function. We can remove the line where we call the preventDefault method since we're using event modifiers. This makes our code look a whole lot cleaner and simpler. Let's give this one last test. Refresh the page. If I were to type in the input, everything would still work. As I type in the last name field, the full name is updated above. The console is still logging the message on every change. This is exactly what we wanted. That wraps it up for event modifiers. Handling events in Vue is painless. We can use modifiers to shorten the amount of code we would normally have to write. This allows us to keep our code tidy and organized. In the previous lecture, we discussed how to use events in Vue. Another set of events are keyboard events. Vue provides a lot of out-of-the-box in terms of keyboard event support. We can trigger an event on any set of keys or on a specific key. Let's look at an example. Let's say we wanted to add a field for a middle name. Inside the data object, we're going to add a new property called middle name. Its initial value will be an empty string. We'll update the full name function to include the middle name. The next step is to create an input field that will allow the user to update the middle name. Inside the document, in between the first and last name fields, we'll insert a new input element. Here's what we want to do. Rather than change the value on input, I want to change the value whenever the user presses the Enter key on their keyboard. We're going to listen for an event called keyUp. We'll want to invoke a function called updateMiddleName if the event is triggered. This function doesn't exist. We'll have to create it inside the methods object. Let's do that next. Inside the function, we're going to update the middle name data property with the value of the input field. The keyUp event we're using is triggered every time a user presses a key and then releases it. This means that the function is invoked on every key release. We're looking to limit which key will trigger the event. We only want to invoke the function if the key released was the Enter key. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the keyboard modifiers documentation page. Keyboard modifiers work similar to event modifiers. They modify how an event works, but with keyboard inputs. It's completely optional to use keyboard modifiers. By using them, you can listen for a specific key. Out of the box, they even provide some aliases for certain keys. You can find the full list in the documentation. They even have an alias for the Enter key. Let's use it. In the template, after the event, we'll add the Enter key modifier. If we were to test the input on the page, nothing would happen. The full name updates the second I press the Enter key. Typically, you would check for something like this with conditional statements. Vue takes a different approach by using modifiers to make things cleaner and simpler. There are times where we'll need to use a key that doesn't have an alias. In cases like these, we can use the code assigned to a key by the browser. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a site that will tell you the key code for any key. If I press Enter, I'll be presented with information about the key I pressed. In a huge font size, I'll be provided a number to represent the key I pressed. However, this is not the key code we need. The code we'll want to use is provided in the corner. The difference between the two is the number is deprecated in most browsers. The key code in the code box is the official code we need to use in our application. We won't be using this code because Vue sets an alias for the Enter key. If we were using a different key that didn't have an alias, we would use the key code in this box. Key modifiers are not limited to keyboard events. For example, let's say for the decrement function, we only want to trigger the function if the user clicks the button while holding the control key. That's easy to pull off. Switch over to the documentation for a moment. Under the alias keys, there's a section called System Modifiers. This is a list of aliases for a set of keys we can use as modifiers. The modifier we'll want to use is called Control. Let's switch back to the editor. Inside the template, we're going to attach a modifier to the click event. The name of the modifier is called Control. As you would expect, the expression inside will execute if the user is holding down the Control key while clicking on the decrement button. Let's give it a test. After refreshing the page, we should check the console for errors. There are none this far. If I click the decrement button, the age does not decrement. After pressing the Control key, does the value decrement like we want? So that's how you would use keyboard modifiers with events. We can use modifiers for events outside of keyboard events. Before I end this lecture, I'm going to revert this change. I'm not interested in having the decrement button only work if the Control key is pressed down. In this lecture, we're going to learn about one last set of modifiers. We can apply special modifiers to the vModel directive. There are 3 modifiers available. Let's explore each one. We'll continue working on the same project. In our application, we have a data property for the age. The age can be updated by clicking on the increment and decrement buttons. That's fine and all, but we should provide an option for allowing the user to modify the age directly. Let's create an input that's bound to the age data property. Open the index.html file. We'll add an input below the last name. The input will be for the age. Let's add a label to help us identify this input. Lastly, we'll add the vModel directive to the input element. The property it should be bound to is the age property. Let's head to the browser to view the app. We can see the input appear below the other inputs. It works great. If we change the value in the input, the age is also updated. We can even click on the buttons to modify the value. One thing that's not noticeable is the type of value we're working with. Let me show you what I mean. Switch back to the editor. Above, we're outputting the age inside a pair of paragraph tags. Before the age, I'm going to add the type of keyword. The type of keyword will instruct our application to output the data type of the variable. Let's go back to the page. Instead of seeing the age, we'll see the data type get outputted. The data type for the age is number. It's because the original value is a number. If I were to press the buttons, the data remains the same. However, if I type in the input, the data type is converted to a string. It doesn't matter if the actual value itself is a number. The reason this happens is because we're using an input. Input elements will always return a string. Even though the input is bound to a value that has the number data type, the browser will convert it to a string. This is the default behavior. It doesn't really affect us at the moment. It can lead to issues down the road. There is one simple way to fix this problem. Let's go back to the editor to find out how we can resolve this issue. There are 2 things we should always do whenever we're working with numbers in an input field. First, we should set the type of input. On the input for the age, we're setting the type to text. Let's change this to number. Setting the type is an HTML feature. It's not specific to Vue. Regardless, it's still something you will want to set when working with numbers. By setting the type attribute, the browser will prevent the visitor from typing non-numeric characters. That lowers the possibility of an error occurring in our application. While it's a great way to add constraint, it doesn't solve our issue. The browser will continue to convert the type to a string. We can convert the type back to a number by using a modifier. The vModel directive can use 3 modifiers. One of them is called number. Let's add it to the directive. The number modifier will perform a type conversion. The value will be converted to a number type. Let's view the browser to confirm this behavior. If I type any number in the input for the age, the data type will remain a number. Great. The number modifier will allow your data properties to hold the number data type. This behavior can prevent unexpected issues when trying to perform calculations. There are 2 other modifiers we're going to quickly look at. They're the lazy and trim modifiers. Let's go back to the editor. We'll apply both modifiers to the input for the first name. It's not required to apply both modifiers to a directive. However, it is an option. The trim modifier will remove excessive whitespace from a value. It's the equivalent of calling the trim function on a string. The lazy modifier will change when the data property is updated. Normally, the data property in our application is updated on every key press. The lazy modifier will delay the change until the visitor has finished typing in the input and moves away from it. This modifier can be useful if you want to perform less updates on the document. Let's go back to the browser. If we were to type into the input for the first name, the name doesn't get updated. The update won't occur until I click away from the input. I'm also going to add extra white space before I do so. After moving away from the input, the first name changes. The white space is also removed. We're able to change the behavior with these two handy modifiers. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one. One of the more difficult concepts for a beginner to grasp is computed properties. It sounds like a complicated feature, but luckily it's like a light switch. Once you learn it, then you pretty much know it forever. It's not as difficult as you may imagine. Before we jump into the code, I want to define the word compute. I know some of you are not native English speakers, so you should understand what this phrase means before moving forward. Put simply, compute means to calculate something. This can be any sort of calculation from basic math to concatenating strings to form a full word, phrase, or sentence. Anytime you have to perform calculations on a value or multiple values, you are performing a computation. Combining this with the word properties gives clarity as to what this means. Computed properties are properties that are calculated in some sort of manner. Alright, just keep that in the back of your mind as we discuss how and what computed properties are in relation to Vue. If we were to look at our Vue instance, would you be able to tell which bit of code would be considered a computed property? If you guessed the full name method, you would be correct. The full name method calculates the full name by combining the first, middle, and last names in the data object. The full name method works better as a computed property. It may not seem like it, but using a method for this sort of situation is costly and inefficient. Let's explore why that is. This method currently works fine. We don't get errors in the console, nor does it give the rest of our application a problem. However, something is going on behind the scenes that we're not seeing. Let's switch back to the editor. Right before I return the value, I'm going to log a message with the console.log function. The message will say the following: full name method was called. I'm going to comment out the message inside the update last name method so that we don't see it in the console. We want to shift our focus to computed properties. Let's check out our app. Make sure you have the console opened. I'm going to update the first name input field. After inputting a value, the full name is updated. Inside the console, the message inside the full name method was logged. That's to be expected since the first name data property was updated. Therefore, the full name method would have to be called again for the latest changes. Now let's see what happens if I were to click on the increment or decrement buttons. Not only does the age get updated, but the full name method gets called again. This happens regardless if we updated the properties for the name. This is the first problem with using a method for calculating a property. Whenever any of the data properties are updated, Vue will render the template again onto the page. This means that any methods in the template are recalled during the process. To be more precise, this applies to methods that are invoked immediately. We do have methods that are called when an event occurs. We don't have to worry about them being called on every render. The full name method is an example of a method called when we don't want it to. It's more desirable for it to be called only when it's necessary. That's possible thanks to computed properties. Let's learn how to use them. Switch back to the editor. Inside the Vue instance, we're going to create another property in our object called computed. It'll be on the same level as the data and methods objects. The value is an object. Inside this object, we can define anything we want. I want to convert the full name method into a computed property. Converting this is as simple as moving the method into the computed object. I'm going to change the message inside to say the following: full name computed property was called. There's one last adjustment we'll need to make. Inside the template, we have to remove the parentheses from the expression. This may seem strange, but Vue treats your computed properties as data. I'll explain more in a moment, but let's check if this works. Let's view the application in the browser. Everything will work normally. If I update the first name, then the full name updates too. The message we logged in the function appears in the console. However, this time, if I were to update the age, the message doesn't get logged. This means that the function doesn't get called even when the age is updated. There is a benefit to using computed properties. Vue will cache the values of computed properties. Let's discuss what happens when a data property is updated. First, it'll scan the function of the computed property. It'll check what data properties you're using inside the function. If any of those values change, Vue will rerun the function and update the value. If a data property was updated that wasn't used inside the function, Vue will not bother updating the value. Therefore, we save on performance and execution time. Vue is smart enough to know when to call the function based on the data used inside the function, even if it isn't actively used. Let me show you what I mean. Back inside the full name function, I'm going to add this.age. I'm not going to bother doing anything with the value. I won't reset or change it. Normally, we wouldn't do something like this. This is just an example. Once you have that set, refresh the page one more time and update the first name. The message is logged in the console. Now I'm going to update the age. This time the message does get logged. It's because we're using the age data property in the method. Vue was able to pick up on that. Since the age gets updated, then the function gets called. I'm going to remove the age from the function because it's unnecessary to have it there. I want to talk a little more about how computed properties are used in terms of how we write it. The first question is, are computed properties data or methods? The answer is a combination of both. The data property is used to store single values. You can store objects and arrays as well. It's not the kind of object where you would store functions. If you want to store functions, you would use the methods property. If you have a function that calculates a value, you would use a computed property. Let's discuss the differences between methods and computed properties for a moment. With methods, you are allowed to calculate values. We can use them in expressions if we want to. In fact, you could use methods exclusively. However, you would lose out on the performance gain that computed properties provide. Methods provide a lot of flexibility. You can make requests, update elements, etc. With computed properties, they serve one purpose, or at least they should, and that is to calculate a value. Unlike methods, you are always expected to return a value. You're free to take other actions, but you must always return a value. This is because the value is what's stored in Vue. We can even inspect this. Back inside the browser, I'm going to switch to the Vue developer tools. Clicking on the root element will show me the data inside my application. A new category will appear called Computed. The full name will be set to the computed value. Vue is storing the value, not the function. That doesn't mean the function is lost forever. It's stored elsewhere. Whenever the value needs to be updated, the function for the computed property is called. This is why we don't add the parentheses in our expressions. It's because we're retrieving the value, not calling the function. The function is called internally by Vue automatically. Another thing you need to be aware of is that you cannot pass data onto the function. If you need to pass on data, then you may want to consider using a method. That does it for computed properties. There's a lot of magic happening behind the scenes to make computed properties work. Using computed properties is simple thanks to that magic. Computed properties can seriously boost the performance of your application with little work. I recommend you play around with them more before moving on to the next lecture. In the resource section, I provide a link to more information about computed properties. I definitely recommend giving it a good read. So far, we've learned about the data, methods, and computed objects in the instance. There is one more property that allows you to manipulate data, which are called watchers. Watchers watch your data for changes. Whenever a change occurs, you can run a function to execute additional logic. In a sense, it's a way to hook into the process of when a value is updated. Something I want to note is that watchers aren't used often. You will most likely use them a few times in your application. It's not something you will use consistently. Throughout this course, you will see real use cases for watchers. Let's learn how to use them. Watchers are pretty easy to implement. On the same level as the data and methods properties, we're going to add a new property called watch. This property will be set to an object. The object will contain a list of properties to watch for. What properties can we watch? It can be any of the properties on the Vue instance. This includes your data and computed properties. The key name must correspond to any of the key names inside the instance. Let's listen for changes to the age property. The value of this property will be the function we want to execute when a change occurs. There are two arguments we can use in the function. They're the new and old values, respectively. We can do whatever we want in the function. We're not obligated to return a value. Regardless of what you do inside the function, Vue will still update the value. We're simply running a function during that process. Developers use watchers to perform additional actions whenever a value changes. This is especially true whenever you want to perform asynchronous tasks. Computed properties are similar to watchers in that they watch our data for changes. It can be confusing as to what the differences are between computed properties and watchers. Computed properties can never be asynchronous, or at least they shouldn't be. Vue expects a value to be returned from the computed properties function. However, watchers don't bear that responsibility. You have the freedom to perform asynchronous tasks. For this example, let's say I wanted to revert the age to its original default value after 3 seconds. Inside this function, we're going to use a setTimeout function. Inside of it, we'll set the age property to 20. Let's give things a test. In the browser, we'll try to update the age. After 3 seconds, it'll revert back to 20 because the watcher function will run when we change the age. By using watchers, we can run additional logic when a value changes. Like I said in the beginning, watchers aren't used as much as data, methods, or computed properties. I wouldn't stress so much about using them. You will learn through experience and throughout this course on when to use them. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one. We've learned a lot so far. There are still a few things I want to dig into before we dive into an exercise project. In this lecture, I want to talk more about binding attributes. Specifically, I want to get into working with the class attribute. It's common to apply styles conditionally based on the data in our app. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with some starter files. We'll be moving away from the previous code base. It's starting to get cluttered. I want to focus on this concept alone. Download, unzip the files, and view them in your editor. Pause the video if you need to. There's nothing special going on in these files. We have the typical HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. I've already gone ahead with preparing a Vue instance for you. Here is what it will look like in the browser. It's a circle that says, "Hi." Above it is a checkbox. It's non-functional at the moment. We'll want to make it functional by changing the background color of the circle if the checkbox is ticked. Back in the editor, inside the CSS file, we have a class called purple, which will change the background color of an element to purple. How do we dynamically add this class to the element? We can dynamically add a class with binding. We'll switch over to the document. We'll bind a class attribute on the div tag with the class circle. I'm applying two class attributes to the same element. Vue is smart enough to merge them after the template has been processed. We don't have to worry about conflicting issues. The value for this attribute will be an object. The object can contain a list of classes to apply. The key name will represent the class name. The value will be the condition. If the condition is true, the class will be added. Otherwise, it'll be removed. The class we want to add conditionally is the purple class. The value will be the data property isPurple. This property doesn't exist, so let's add it in. Back in the script, we'll define the data function in the configuration object. Inside the data object, we'll add the isPurple property. The initial value will be false. Because the value will always be false, the class will never be applied to the element. We'll want to change that by using the checkbox to toggle the data property. Back inside the document, we're going to use the vModel directive on the checkbox. The vModel directive will work on all form elements, including the select and text area elements. We're going to set this to isPurple. That will take care of toggling the value. If the box is ticked, then the value will be toggled to true. We're finished with binding the input. Back inside the browser, we'll refresh the page. If we look inside the console, we won't find errors. That's great. The initial color of the circle will be green. If we were to toggle the checkbox, the circle would toggle from green to purple. By binding the class attribute, Vue can help us manage the classes for an element. We can use object syntax for dynamically binding classes to elements. In the object, the key names represent the class names. Their value will be the condition to check if the class should be added to the element. Vue will take care of constantly checking the data for changes. It'll swap classes whenever data changes. There is a slight problem with this approach. We're checking for one class, but this can grow to be several classes. Our template would become difficult to read the more classes we add. Luckily, we can use computed properties to solve this dilemma. We're going to copy this object. Then in the Vue instance, we're going to create a computed property called CircleClasses. Inside the function, we'll return the object we copied earlier. We'll need to make one slight adjustment to the object. The isPurple condition will need to be updated to this.isPurple since we're using this in the Vue instance. It's a minor change. Next, inside the template, we can remove the object. We can replace it with the following expression, CircleClasses. Let's go back to the page and refresh it. Toggling the checkbox will toggle the background color like before. We're experiencing the same behavior, but now it's easier to read and format the object. We also gain the performance boost of using computed properties. Computed properties update whenever the data it uses is updated. Let's keep playing around with this. Not every class has to be conditionally checked. Instead, you can jump around different classes. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go back to the editor. We're going to create a drop-down below the checkbox where the text color can be white, black, or orange. For the color white, I left the value blank because the default color is already white. We don't need to specify a class. I've defined classes for changing the text color to black and orange. You can find them in the CSS file. We'll need to bind this dropdown to a value in our data object. We'll use the vModel directive. We'll set it to the selected color property. This data property doesn't exist in our application. We'll need to define it. Inside the data object, we'll define this property. The initial value will be an empty string. The last step is to bind the value to the circle element. Inside the template, we'll change the class binding to selected color. Alright, let's give it a test. Refresh the page. The circle will appear as normal. If I were to select a different color in the drop-down, the text color would change. This is exactly what we wanted. However, if I were to tick the checkbox, the color change doesn't get applied. This is because we're passing in one expression. Unfortunately, we can't use the object syntax since we're not checking if a class should be added. We could refactor the object to check if a specific class should be added, but there's a better solution. Switch back to the editor. Inside the template, we're going to update the class attribute to be an array. For the second value in the array, we're going to pass in circle classes. Vue will loop through the array. It'll apply the first item in the array as a class. The second item will have its properties iterated. It'll run through each condition to determine whether a class should be applied or not. By using an array, we get the best of both worlds. Let's give this application another test. Refresh the page and try toggling between both input fields. No matter what combination we choose, the classes will work as intended. You're free to use array or object syntax. You can even choose neither. It's acceptable to bind one value. It depends on the situation you're in. Alright, that's enough for now. Let's move forward. In this lecture, we're going to look at how we can bind the style attribute on an element. In some cases, you may want to apply stylings directly on the element. For example, let's say I wanted to change the size of the circle. There are three properties we'll need to change: the width, height, and line height. Creating a set of classes that would cover every size possible would be time-consuming. It would be much better to set the styles directly on the elements. Back in the editor, inside the data object, we're going to create a property called size. Its initial value will be set to 150. We're setting it to 150 because that's the initial value in the CSS class. Then, inside the template, below the dropdown, we're going to create an input field with the number type. We'll be dealing with numeric values. The number type will prevent the user from entering non-numeric characters into the input field. We're going to use the vModel directive once again to bind the value to this input field. We'll bind it to the size data property. The last step is to update the circle to use these values. Inside the element, we're going to bind the style attribute. We'll set this attribute to an object. Unlike before, where you're performing conditional checks, we'll be setting the CSS properties dynamically. If I want to set the circle's width, then I would add that in as a property. The value is what will be used as the CSS value. We're going to set this property to the size data property with the pixel measurement. I'll do the same for the height as well. This will make the circle nice and even. However, there is one additional property I'd like to set. In order to make the text vertically aligned, we'll need to set the line height property. If you set the line height to the same value as the height, the inner text will be aligned in the center. However, typing line height is not a valid property name. Therefore, there are two solutions we can use to add this in. The first solution is to wrap it in quotes. This solution is valid and will work. Alternatively, you can remove the quotes and camel case the name. Vue will detect the camel casing. It'll take care of lowercasing the word. It'll add dashes between each word. Either solution works. It's all preference in the end. I prefer to use camel casing because it's easier to read. We're already typing this inside of a string where there is no syntax highlighting. Using quotes can make things difficult to read. We'll set this property to the size data property with the pixel unit measurement. Be sure that your code matches mine. I'm going to refresh the page one more time to test the application. we'll see the input field with an initial value of 150. If I were to increase or decrease the amounts, the circle would adjust accordingly. You can open the Elements panel in the Developer Tools to view the changes in real time. This effect is cool to see. It's possible thanks to Vue. Similar to classes, we can use the array syntax to apply a list of stylings. Let's give it a try. Switch back to the editor. Inside the style attribute, we'll wrap this object with an array. Then, after the first object, we'll add in another object with a transform property. The value will be a basic rotation. We'll take the time to format the code. A lot is going on inside this attribute. At this point, it may be better to use a computed property. I'll leave that as an exercise for you to do. We are using two objects for applying stylings to the element. For the most part, you usually wouldn't have to do this, but it's nice to know you can pass in multiple objects for styles. Let's refresh the page to check out the result. The circle will be tilted 30 degrees. This value isn't dynamic, but it still gets the point across that you can pass in multiple objects with separate stylings if you ever need that kind of control. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the official documentation for adding classes and styles to your elements. This page goes over everything we've covered thus far. I recommend giving it a good read before moving on to the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to learn about conditional rendering. Conditional rendering is when elements are added or removed from the document based on a condition. If a condition is truthy, the element is added to the page. Otherwise, the element is removed. Previously, we talked about how to bind classes and stylings to an element. We can use CSS styles to hide an element on the page. This solution can be implemented by toggling the display or visibility properties on an element. While it's a valid solution, there's an alternative solution from Vue for toggling elements. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with some starter files. Download it, unzip the contents, and point your editor to those files. Pause the video if you need to. There's not much going on with what I have provided you. In the HTML file, we have the usual div element with the ID app. In the script file, we're creating a new instance. First, we'll look at how to add or remove an element based on the data inside the Vue instance. In the template, we'll add a paragraph tag. The contents will be the following: showing v-if directive content. The goal is to toggle the element by using a directive called v-if. This feature is what Vue calls conditional rendering. If a specific condition is met, the element will be rendered onto the template. We'll apply the v-if directive to the paragraph tag. The value must be the condition. We'll set the condition to the following: mode equals 1. The mode property does not exist. Let's create it inside the data object. In the script file, we'll define the data function inside the configuration object. Next, we'll create the mode data property with an initial value of 1. Time to give the app a test in the browser. The paragraph tag renders onto the document without a problem. If we were to view this in the Elements panel, we would notice that nothing unusual is applied to the element. Vue can keep track of this element based on the data. We're going to switch to the console panel of the developer tools. We're going to access the Vue instance through the VM variable. We'll update the mode data property to 2. This value is random. I'm not choosing the number 2 for any reason. After reassigning the value, the paragraph disappears. This is because the condition is no longer true. Therefore, the element gets removed. We can even check the Elements panel to check if it was removed. This is something important I want to highlight. Vue will not hide the element. It will altogether remove the element from the document. I'm going to switch back to the console and reassign the value back to 1. The paragraph element is back. If we were to check the Elements panel, the element was added back in. It appears in the same spot with the same content. This functionality is great. We don't have to use CSS tricks to hide the element whenever we don't want it to appear. Vue will automatically keep track of where the element was placed initially. It'll add or remove elements based on the conditions you set in the directives. The v-if directive is not the only conditional directive we have at our disposal. Back inside the editor, we're going to add 2 more sets of paragraph tags with some dummy content. The second set of paragraph tags will have the v-else-if directive applied to it. This directive can only be used after an element that is using the v-if directive. For example, if we inserted another paragraph above this element, this will break the application. Vue would throw an error because it's expecting the element before to have the v-if directive applied to it. I'm going to remove this since we don't want an error. The value for the v-else-if directive must be a condition that evaluates to true or false. We're going to check if mode is equal to 2. This condition will be checked if the condition inside the v-if directive returns false. If the first v-if directive returns true, this will not be checked even if the condition for this directive is true. For the last paragraph element, we're going to apply the v-else directive. We don't need to add a condition because Vue will not check it. This directive will make the element appear on the page if previous conditions fail. Once again, we are required to have this element appear on the same level and after the other conditional directives. It works the same way as JavaScript conditional statements. One more thing. We're not limited to what elements we can use. The conditional directives don't have to be applied to the same element. We can use different elements. We can change the second paragraph tag to an h3 tag. This structure is considered valid because it's still at the same level. However, I can't wrap it with another tag like a div tag. Even though the condition is provided after the v-if directive, the fact that it isn't on the same level will throw an error. I'm going to undo this. Those are some limitations you should be aware of before using this directive. Before we test our app, we're going to create a drop-down below everything. We'll add an option for each conditional directive. We want to be able to update the mode data property without having to use the console. We're using the vModel directive for updating the mode data property. Make sure you have the same as me before continuing. I'm going to refresh the page. The content in the first paragraph element will be visible. If I were to set the mode property to 2, then the h3 element will appear, thus proving that the elements don't have to be the same. Lastly, we'll set the mode property to 3, which will show the element with the v-else directive. This directive will only be triggered if all previous conditions failed. I'm going to switch to the Elements panel. I'm going to toggle between the modes using the drop-down. As I do so, Vue can handle adding and removing elements from the document. This is a powerful feature that takes very little work on our side to make function. Let's take things a step further. Sometimes you want to display multiple elements without having to use numerous conditions. Let's look at an example. In the document, let's say we want to render a paragraph and h3 tag conditionally. We'll add a paragraph tag above the heading. This tag will break the conditional directive chain. Vue will throw an error if we do this. But let's say I wanted both elements to appear if the second condition we have is true. The obvious solution would be to wrap both elements with a div tag. Then we can move the directive to the div element. This solution will work, but there's one problem with it. It changes the structure of our document. It may be fine if you're working on a simple app. If you're working on a larger app, it may be necessary to maintain the document's structure because of CSS. The CSS may expect the document to be structured a certain way. Your styles may not be so forgiving if you change the structure of the document. If the HTML structure changes, you may have to make changes to your CSS to accommodate this scenario continually. That's not very fun, and it can make our document more cluttered than it has to be. We can maintain the same structure by replacing the div tag with the template tag. This is not an official HTML element, but it is a valid Vue element. Vue will render the contents of the template tag without rendering the tag itself. As a result, we'll still be able to keep our HTML structure without ruining our styling's integrity. Let's see what this looks like. I'll refresh the page one more time. If I were to update the mode property to 2, both elements inside the template tag would appear. That's exactly what we wanted. If we were to switch to the Elements panel of the developer tools, we would see both elements appear without the template tag wrapped around it. Vue will take care of removing it while still allowing the content inside to be rendered. This is one way of handling conditional rendering. The VIF, VElseIf, and VElse directives can handle conditional rendering. In the next lecture, we'll look at an alternative solution for conditionally rendering content. In this lecture, we're going to learn about the vShow directive. Vue provides an alternative solution to conditional rendering. Sometimes you'll want the element to stay exactly where it is, but hide it with CSS. It's possible to perform this task by binding styles and classes. However, Vue provides a solution out of the box for this specific task. Back inside the template, we're going to add an italics element with a simple message. We're going to apply the vShow directive. This directive expects a condition. We're going to set the condition to the following: is mode equal to 1? By default, the element should appear based on the condition. Let's give it a test. If I refresh the page, the element will appear without a problem. If I were to switch modes, it would disappear. It works similar to the VIF directives, but with one noticeable difference. Viewing the Elements panel shows that the element was not removed from the document. Instead, Vue will apply the Display CSS property. The value for this property will be none. This value hides the element from view. That's the main difference between vShow and VIF directives. If I were to set the mode back to 1, the stylings are removed. We've learned about the two ways to render elements conditionally. There are quite a considerable number of differences you should take into account whenever using them. Let's start with the vShow directive. Unlike the VIF directive, the element does not get removed if the condition turns out to be false. Instead, the element will remain in the document. The Display CSS property will be set to none. This value will hide it from view. You're limited to using the vShow directive alone. It will not work with the template tag I showed you, nor will it work with the VElse directive. Something you should take into consideration is the performance you may gain or lose from using it. During the compilation of the template, Vue has to decide what has to be rendered. For every element added, you take a small performance hit. It isn't massive. It's not like your users will notice. However, it is a performance loss. After the element is loaded, toggling the stylings of an element is a reasonably cheap cost. It's quick and easy. Therefore, using the vShow directive is expensive on load but cheap when it comes to toggling an element's appearance. Next, we have the VIF directive, which does support the template tag, VElseIf, and VElse directives. Unlike the vShow directive, it will altogether remove or add the element based on the condition. One of the main advantages of this is that the directive is lazy. If the condition evaluates to false on the initial page load, the element will not be added to the page. The browser doesn't have to waste time painting the element. This saves resources on the client's machine because the element is never added to the document. However, it is expensive on toggles. As you can imagine, adding or removing elements in the exact same spot every time is not an easy or cheap task. It does require a bit of power to perform. If you're dealing with a few elements, it isn't that big of a deal. On the other hand, if you have hundreds of elements, you will definitely feel it. Overall, I wouldn't worry about it a lot. Either solution is viable in any application. My personal opinion is that you should use the vShow directive if the element is toggled frequently. Suppose the element is rarely toggled from Vue. The vIf directive is more optimal. At the end of the day, it's up to you to decide which is the best one to use. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the official documentation page for conditional rendering. It'll go over everything we've covered so far about conditional rendering. There are additional examples and use cases available on this page. I definitely recommend you give it a good read before moving on. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to render a list. If you think about it, lists are used for a lot of things. Menus, users, posts, etc. It's a common task in most applications. Vue can help us loop through an array of items to render a list of elements. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with some initial files. Download it, unzip the contents, and point your editor to the files. Pause the video if you need to. There's nothing special going on in these files. Inside the JavaScript file, I have two data properties. We'll be looping through them. These two properties represent the three scenarios you'll come across when rendering lists. You'll either want to loop through an array of objects, or loop through an object's properties. We can handle these three scenarios in Vue. For our first example, I have an array of birds. Inside the template, we're going to create an unordered list with one list item. To loop through an array, you have to use the v_for directive. I'm going to apply this to the list item. This directive will allow us to loop through an array. The expression will be slightly different than what we've dealt with so far. Vue requires a specific format for the expression. We're going to input the following: bird in birds. The format is as follows. We need to provide an alias to reference the item in the current iteration of the loop. For instance, the first item in the array is pigeons. So, in the first iteration, the name bird will represent the value pigeons. In the second iteration, it'll be eagles, so on and so forth. Afterward, we need to type the in keyword. This keyword will tell Vue that you're ready to tell it what array it will loop through. Lastly, we pass in the name of the array to loop through, which is the bird's data property. Be aware that you're not forced to name your reference anything specific. We could have called this flying creature if we wanted to. It's common practice to name the alias as the singular version of the array name. That's the basics of using the v_for directive. We can begin outputting the data. Inside the list item, we're going to create an expression. The expression will be bird. Vue will take care of performing interpolation on this expression. It'll replace it with the current item in the array. We're not limited to using expressions inside the element. We can apply directives to the element. We can use the bird reference. For instance, we can bind the class attribute to the bird alias. We can't use the bird reference outside of the element. We're restricted to using it on or in the element. This would include children elements if we had any. It's time to test the app in the browser. If we did everything right, we will see the list of birds on the page. Inspect the elements and search for the list items. Each list item will have the class attribute applied to it with the bird's name as the class name. These don't do anything, but I wanted to show you that you can use the reference in directives or attributes as well. You're not limited to grabbing the value. Sometimes you'll want to grab the index in the loop. Back inside the template, we're going to wrap the bird alias with parentheses. If we're solely interested in the value of the current iteration, we can provide an alias for the value. However, if we'd like to grab the index and value, we'll need to wrap this part of the expression with parentheses. Vue requires we provide an alias for the name and index. We're going to call this index. We're not required to use this name. We can call it whatever we want. It's common practice to call it index. As a result, the alias bird will be used to represent the value in the current iteration, whereas the alias index will be used to represent the current index of the item. We'll be able to use the index in our loop. We're going to add an expression after the value. The expression will output the index. Let's refresh the page to see what this will look like. The index, along with the name of the bird, will appear on the list. Vue makes it dead simple to loop through an array of items. Next, let's begin looping through an array of objects. I want to quickly review the data in the Vue instance for a moment. We have a data property called people. This property is an array of objects. Each object is storing an individual's name and age. We want to display this information on the page. It's very similar to the last example. Switching to the template, we're going to create a horizontal line. Under it, we'll create another unordered list. We're adding this in to help make things look cleaner. If we want to loop through the objects in the array, we'll have to use the v_for directive. We'll add the directive to the list item element. The expression will be the following: person in people. We can begin to output the contents of the object. We'll create two sets of div tags to output the name and age properties. To access the name and age, we can use dot notation. It's the same as accessing a property in a regular JavaScript object. It's not much different. Let's give things a test. If I were to refresh the page, the list of people would appear below with each person's name and age. This is exactly what we wanted. However, there is a bit of a problem. What if we had dozens of properties to display? Having to type each property name would be time-consuming. Luckily, the v_for directive is capable of looping through objects as well. We're not limited to looping through arrays. Back inside the template, we're going to remove the second pair of div tags. Then, we're going to apply the v_for directive to the div element and set the expression to value key in person. The alias names we set in the parentheses represent slightly different values than when we worked with arrays. In the previous example, the first name would represent the value in the current iteration. The second name would represent the index. However, when you're looping through properties in an object, the first name will represent the property's value, and the second name will represent the key name of that property. Therefore, the index is no longer available to us. If we want to use the index, then we'll need to add one more name. I'm going to set this to index. We'll be given access to the value, key name, and index. We're going to output all three of these inside the current loop. We're essentially looping inside of another loop. It's not uncommon to have to do things like this. It's a completely valid solution. Be careful when performing nested loops. It does require more time to execute. It won't be noticeable in our application, but in larger ones, you'll definitely see the performance difference. Let's give things a test. Refreshing the page will result in the same thing as before. We have a list of people. Each person has their name and age outputted. Fantastic. Keep in mind that you're not required to use all these values. You can stick to grabbing the value of the property. If you don't need the key name or index, it's not required to provide aliases. Keep your code simple. There is one more thing I want to show you before we end things. There is a problem with the loops we currently have. Let's focus on the first loop. You may want to implement a feature that will allow your users to filter the data. Sometimes you may even want to add or remove things from the current array. In any of these situations, you may want to keep track of each item. Currently, that's not possible. You may be thinking, what about their index? That works at the start, but the index isn't wholly reliable. For instance, the last bird in this array is parrots. The index of this bird is 3. Each item in the array will have a unique index, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the index is permanently associated with that item in the array. Let me show you what I mean. I'll open the console for a moment. I'll input the following: vm.birds.shift. This function will remove the first item in the array. Looking at the list again, you'll notice the index for parrots has changed to 2. The index is still unique, but it has changed. Vue is capable of keeping track of these changes for you. For example, we'll change the name of the bird by using the following: vm.birds2 equals robins. This line will change the bird in the second index from parrots to robins. This works without a problem. However, something as simple as this can prove to be problematic down the line. Inside a more complex application, items in the array can move around due to additions or removal of data. This can confuse Vue. It can even lead to an update where you don't want an update to occur. This issue can happen because Vue has lost track of certain elements. That's not what we want to happen. Luckily, there's a way to keep track of items in arrays even if they move around. Back inside the template, we're going to bind the key attribute on the list item. The value for this must be a unique name for each iteration in the loop. We have a basic array where each bird has a unique name. We can set this to bird. Now we have a way to uniquely identify an item in the array even if any of their positions change. Let's give this a try. I'm going to switch back to the browser and refresh. The list will work as usual. You may be a little confused because we can't see the difference in this example. Once again, this is useful in more complex applications. In the next lecture, I'll dive more into why this is important and provide a more realistic example. If you already understand without having to see the problem, you can skip that lecture and move right along. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the official documentation page for list rendering. I recommend you give this a read before moving on. It also offers a better explanation of the key attribute. If you don't understand, then don't worry. I'll clear everything up in the next lecture. In a previous lecture, I ended things off by talking about the key attribute. It's recommended that you add it to the element that you're looping through. I wasn't completely apparent why you would want to add it. In this lecture, I want to provide absolute clarity as to the reason why you would want to use the key attribute. The main reason is that it'll prevent strange behavior from happening. Let's first look at the problem. Then, we'll see how the key attribute solves that problem. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with the files you'll need. Download it, unzip the contents, and point your editor to those files. Pause the video if you need to. Inside the template, we have a div tag with the class card. There's a header and paragraph where the header will contain the name, and the paragraph will contain a message. We'll be looping through this element in a moment. Inside the JavaScript file, I have initialized a Vue instance. Inside the data property, I have a list of people with their names and a message. As for the CSS, I've added a bit more CSS than usual. Nothing in here is related to Vue, but I decided to add more visual information so that things are clearer for this lecture. Alright, let's begin working on the application. It's going to be simple. All I want to do is loop through the people data array and render it onto the template. We'll need to use the v-for directive to loop through the data. Inside the template, we're going to apply the v-for directive to the div tag with the class of card. The expression will be person in people. Next, we'll replace the static text with their respective expressions. The heading will be person.name, and the paragraph will be person.message. We're not going to apply the key attribute yet. Right above the list of people, we have a button. If clicked, I want to move the first person on the list to the bottom. Therefore, we're going to listen for an event using the @ character. The event to listen for is called click. The name of the method to run will be called move. This method doesn't exist, so let's create it. Back inside the Vue instance, we'll add the methods object. After adding it in, we'll define the move function. The move function will perform one simple task. It'll move the first item in the array to the end of the array. That's pretty simple to do. We'll create a variable called first and set it to this.people.shift. As you may know, the shift method will remove the first item in the array and then return that removed item. We can re-add the item by using the this.people.push method and pass in the first variable. This function is how we can move the first item of the array to the end. Let's refresh the page to see if it works. You should have something similar to me. The list of people gets outputted without a problem. If I were to click the button, the first person would move to the bottom of the list. I can click this as many times as I'd like, and everything will work as expected. Everything seems to be working fine. That's because we have a basic UI. Things can become more complicated the moment we add some interactive elements like an input. Let's see what happens if we were to add an input field. Back in the document, we're going to add an input field after the paragraph tag. We're not going to add any events, bind any attributes, or make it functional. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to leave it as an ordinary input field. Let's try testing things out again. We'll refresh the page one more time. Everything works as expected. If I press the button, then everything moves accordingly. Or so it seems. The first person is now Rick. Before I press the button, I'm going to fill in the input field for Rick randomly. If I press the button, you would expect the input to move with Rick, but that's not what happens. Rick moves to the last spot, but the input field doesn't. The text we had inside the input remained. It should have moved down below. Instead, the input now belongs to Amy. What's the problem? Vue is making a performance decision. It'll look at what's happening and decide the best way to approach this. For the most part, we've benefited from this. Vue will notice a change in the array, but it'll also notice that there are 3 items in the array and 3 items in the template. As I stated previously, adding and removing elements from a template is a bit of a performance hit. Therefore, Vue will not move the elements in the template. It won't remove the element, nor will it add a new one afterward, just like we're doing in our JavaScript. Instead, it'll move the data around. What do I mean by this? Currently, the first element has the name, Amy. By pressing the button, Vue will not move the element. It will instead move the text itself to the bottom. Only the data is moving around, not the elements. That worked fine previously, but now we have a dilemma. Each card has an input that doesn't get moved. We want the input to move along with the data. The recommended solution is to use the key attribute. Let's try using that, and then I'll explain what's going on. Back inside the template, we're going to apply the key attribute to the card element and bind it. The value should be a unique value on each iteration. Typically, this would be an ID. At the moment, we don't have an ID, but the name is unique to each item in the array. We'll use that as an ID. We'll pass it in. Alright, let's see if this fixes things. I'll refresh the page once more and try moving things around. Everything works as before. We'll input something into John's card and move it around. Vue has not only moved the data, but it has also moved the input. It doesn't matter how many times I press the button. John will be moved appropriately along with the input. Alright, so what's going on this time? Vue will notice that you have a key attribute added to the element. This attribute tells Vue that the data belongs to this element. Therefore, everything inside this element is now related to the person it's displaying. Whenever the data gets updated, and the data has to move around, the elements will also move with it. Even if there's no data attached to the input field itself, since it's inside the element, it'll get moved as well. There are two ways that Vue will move things around. Without the key attribute, Vue will move the data around, but not the elements themselves. This process is what Vue calls patching. By adding the key attribute, we're forcing the elements to move. This process is more costly in terms of performance. However, the main benefit is that we don't have to worry about strange behavior. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to more information about keys for list rendering. The overall gist of this is that you should always use the key attribute. The only reason to not use a key is when the list is simple. However, once you start introducing animations, forms, and components into the mix, the key attribute will be a lifesaver. It'll relieve you of many headaches. I always recommend you use it. If you ever experience any elements not behaving the way you expect them to inside a loop, try to check if the key attribute is applied. If not, then add it in and see if that solves your problem. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one.